August 23, 1945. 2 weeks after the Emperor's voice crackled across radios throughout Japan, announcing surrender in language so archaic, most citizens struggled to comprehend its meaning. On Okinawa, in a former Japanese military hospital compound now converted into an Allied detention facility, 47 Japanese women stand in a concrete washroom that still smells of disinfectant and something older, the copper scent of blood that no amount of scrubbing can fully erase. They are nurses, mostly, conscripted into the Imperial Army's Medical Corps, though a few are comfort station administrators, telegraph operators, civilian employees caught in the machinery of total war. They have been prisoners for 6 days. They have not bathed in 3 weeks. Their uniforms are stiff with sweat, mud, and stains they do not want to name. They expect nothing. Survival has taught them to expect nothing. An American nurse, a lieutenant with the Army Nurse Corps whose name tag reads Peterson, enters the washroom accompanied by a Japanese-American translator, a Nisei woman in a WAC uniform who speaks with a California accent. Peterson explains through the translator that the women will shower in groups of 10. They will be given soap, towels, and clean clothes. The water is hot. She says this last part matter-of-factly, as if it is obvious, as if hot water is not a luxury beyond imagining. The first group of 10 women undresses slowly, their hands uncertain. They have bathed in frigid streams, in rainwater collected in helmets, in nothing at all for weeks at a time. Hot water is something from another life, from before the war consumed the world. One woman, no more than 22, reaches toward the shower nozzle and turns it. Water streams out, not cold, not lukewarm, but genuinely hot, steaming in the tropical air. She jerks her hand back as if burned, then slowly, hesitantly, places her palm under the stream again. The heat soaks into her skin. Her face crumples. She begins to cry, silently, shoulders shaking, water and tears mixing on her face. Within seconds, 3 other women are crying too, standing under the hot water with their eyes closed and their hands pressed to their mouths, trying to contain sounds that will not be contained. Lieutenant Peterson does not understand. She looks at the translator, confused. Why are they crying? The translator watches the women for a long moment before answering. They did not think they would be treated like human beings, she says quietly. They thought they would be killed. Or worse, they did not expect kindness. They did not expect hot water. Peterson nods slowly, but her face shows she still does not fully comprehend the weight of what she is witnessing. She is 28 years old, from Minnesota, and has seen terrible things. Field hospitals where boys died screaming, burn wards where the smell never left her clothes. But she has not lived inside a culture that taught its women that capture meant death worse than death itself, that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, that the enemy were demons who would violate and destroy everything they touched. She has not been indoctrinated since childhood to believe that hot water, this ordinary, unremarkable comfort, is an unthinkable luxury reserved for the deserving, and that prisoners are never, ever deserving. The women stand under the hot water and weep, and in that concrete washroom on an island devastated by the war's final battle, something breaks that is not mechanical, not visible, but fundamental. It breaks quietly, in the space between expectation and reality, between propaganda and experience, between the empire that promised glorious death and the enemy that offered hot showers. To understand why hot water shattered these women, you must first understand what they were taught about themselves, about their enemy, and about what it meant to be captured. In Imperial Japan, the concept of surrender was not merely discouraged, it was unthinkable, a violation of everything the military code of Bushido represented. Soldiers were taught from their first day of training that death was preferable to capture. The Imperial Rescript to soldiers and sailors, issued in 1882 and drilled into every recruit, stated explicitly, Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die to preserve your honor. This was not metaphor. It was instruction. Surrender was worse than death because it brought eternal shame not just to the individual, but to their family, their ancestors, their entire lineage. A soldier who surrendered was already dead in the eyes of society. They simply had the misfortune to still be breathing. For women, the stakes were even more visceral. Japanese women in military service, nurses, communication operators, comfort station workers, were not officially soldiers, but they operated in military zones and wore military-adjacent uniforms. They were taught that capture by the enemy meant systematic rape, torture, mutilation, and eventual death. The propaganda was explicit and relentless. American soldiers were portrayed as savage beasts who would defile Japanese women before killing them. Soviet soldiers were described as even worse, inhuman monsters who committed atrocities too graphic for official media to describe fully. Women in uniform were given grenades and told that if capture became imminent, they should use the grenade on themselves. Death by one's own hand was honorable. Death at the hands of the enemy was unspeakable. This was not abstract fear. It was policy, drilled into consciousness through training, propaganda films, and the testimonies of soldiers returning from China, where atrocities committed by Japanese forces against Chinese civilians were well documented but reframed in propaganda as evidence of what the enemy would do to Japanese women if given the chance. The logic was circular and totalizing. Because Japanese forces committed atrocities, the enemy surely would too. Because the enemy were subhuman, they would act inhumanly. And because capture meant defilement worse than death, the only rational response was suicide. By August 1945, this ideology had driven thousands of Japanese civilians and military personnel to mass suicide rather than face capture. On Saipan in 1944, more than 1,000 civilians jumped from cliffs rather than surrender to American forces. On Okinawa in 1945, the numbers were staggering. Estimates suggest that between 20,000 and 40,000 Okinawan civilians died, many by their own hands, convinced by Japanese military authorities that American forces would rape the women and kill the men. Entire families died together, mothers killing their children before killing themselves. The logic of total war twisted into a logic of total death. The 47 women standing in that washroom in August 1945 survived because they did not have access to grenades, or because something stayed their hands at the critical moment, or because they were captured too quickly to act. They expected to die badly. They expected rape, torture, humiliation designed to break them before killing them. Instead, they were given medical examinations, food, and told to wait. And now, 6 days into captivity, they are being told to shower with hot water, as if they are people, as if they matter. The cognitive dissonance is unbearable. Everything they know says this cannot be real, that the kindness is a prelude to cruelty, that the hot water is a trick, but the water runs warm against their skin, and it does not stop. And Lieutenant Peterson stands by the door with her clipboard, bored and professional, and there is no cruelty in her face, no anticipation of violence. There is just a woman doing her job, processing prisoners according to regulations that include hygiene, medical care, and basic human dignity. The Imperial Japanese Army's treatment of prisoners of war provides a stark contrast. Japanese forces captured approximately 140,000 Allied military personnel during World War II, along with hundreds of thousands of Asian civilians pressed into forced labor. The mortality rate among Allied POWs held by Japan was approximately 27%. 1 in 4 prisoners died in captivity. By comparison, the mortality rate for Allied POWs held by Germany was roughly 4%. The difference was not accidental. It stemmed from a military culture that viewed prisoners as fundamentally worthless, as men who had forfeited their right to humane treatment by surrendering. Japanese POW camps were characterized by starvation rations, forced labor, medical neglect, and systematic brutality. Prisoners were beaten for minor infractions, denied adequate medical care, worked beyond the limits of human endurance. The Burma-Thailand Railway, built using Allied POW and Asian forced labor, killed an estimated 12,600 Allied prisoners and between 40,000 and 70,000 Asian laborers. The mortality was not incidental, it was baked into the logistics. The Japanese military command did not allocate sufficient food, medicine, or rest because prisoners were not worth the resources. They were already dead men, shadows, less than human. This was the framework Japanese women understood. If their own military treated prisoners with such brutality, if Japanese soldiers were taught that captured enemies deserved only contempt and suffering, then what would happen to Japanese prisoners in Allied hands? The propaganda told them they would be treated far worse because the Americans were more brutal, more savage, less civilized than even the harshest Japanese military policemen. The reality was bureaucratic, regulated, and boring. The United States military operated under the Geneva Convention guidelines for the treatment of prisoners of war, however imperfectly. POW camps in the United States and Allied-controlled territories provided food, medical care, housing, and opportunities for recreation. The treatment was not luxurious, and it was not without problems. There were abuses, inadequacies, moments of cruelty born from racism, and the rage of men who had seen their friends die. But as policy, as structure, as the baseline expectation, Allied POW camps aimed for humane treatment. Prisoners were given sufficient food to maintain health. They received medical attention. They were allowed to bathe, to write letters home, to exist as human beings rather than disposable shadows. For Japanese prisoners, encountering this reality was psychologically destabilizing. Everything they had been taught said this was impossible. The propaganda was so totalizing, so deeply embedded in their understanding of the world, that when it proved false, the entire ideological structure began to crack. The hot water becomes the symbol of that crack. Not because hot water is revolutionary, but because it is ordinary. It is such a small kindness, such a basic comfort, that its presence reveals the profound inhumanity of the system that taught these women to expect nothing. If the enemy provides hot water for bathing, what else was a lie? If prisoners are treated with basic dignity, what does that say about the empire that promised glorious death was the only honorable path? If American soldiers are not demons but board administrators processing paperwork, what was the war for? Corporal Yamamoto Setsuko, a 23-year-old nurse from Hiroshima Prefecture, captured on Okinawa in late June 1945, later described the shower experience in testimony collected by Allied interrogators. Her account, archived in the National Archives and Records Administration, provides a rare window into the psychological impact. We were told that if we were captured, we would be used by many soldiers until we died. We were told it would be better to die by our own hands. When we were taken prisoner, I waited for that to happen. Every day I waited. But instead, they gave us food. Not much, but more than we had eaten in weeks. They gave us medical examinations. Female doctors, female nurses. I did not understand. On the 6th day, they told us we would bathe. I thought this was when it would happen, that we would be taken one by one, and it would begin. But they led us to a washroom with many showers. An American nurse showed us how to turn the water on. I turned it, and the water was hot. I could not believe it. I thought it was a mistake, but it was not a mistake. They had heated water for us, for prisoners, for enemy women. I stood under that water, and I cried because I realized that everything we were told was lies. If they gave us hot water, they were not demons. And if they were not demons, then what were we? What had we done? This testimony is one of dozens collected by Allied intelligence officers in the months following Japan's surrender. The interrogators were looking for military information, troop movements, supply lines, strategic intelligence. What they found instead were women psychologically shattered not by cruelty, but by its absence. The expected brutality never materialized, and that void, the space where torture and death were supposed to be, filled instead with hot water, clean clothes, and board efficiency. The washroom itself holds symbolic weight. It is a liminal space, a place of transformation, where the old self is washed away and a new self emerges. In Japanese culture, bathing is ritual as much as hygiene, a moment of purification, of release, of returning to a state of cleanliness that has moral as well as physical dimensions. The women entering that washroom are filthy in ways that soap cannot fully address. They carry the dirt of war, but also the shame of capture, the belief that they are already dead, already dishonored, already beyond redemption. The hot water does not wash away the war, but it offers something unexpected, the possibility that they might be allowed to remain human, that their captors see them not as demons to be destroyed or bodies to be used, but as prisoners requiring processing, a category that includes medical care, hygiene, and the small dignities that mark the boundary between civilization and its collapse. Lieutenant Peterson and her colleagues do not think of themselves as offering dignity. They are following regulations. The U.S. Army Medical Department's guidelines for POW processing included provisions for delousing, bathing, and initial medical screening. Hot water was standard because it was more effective at removing dirt and potential disease vectors. The kindness was procedural, not personal. But intention does not determine impact. The women standing under those showers experienced the hot water as mercy, as a refutation of everything they were taught, as evidence that the world is not what they believed it to be. This realization is not comforting. It is terrifying. If the enemy is not who they thought, then the empire lied. If the empire lied about the enemy, what else did it lie about? The promises of victory, the assurances that Japan was fighting a sacred war to liberate Asia from Western colonialism, the insistence that death was preferable to dishonor. All of it becomes suspect. The hot water is a crack in the wall, and through that crack, the women glimpse the possibility that their suffering was not noble, not necessary, not part of a grand design, but simply suffering, pointless, brutal, and built on fabrications. The transformation that begins in that washroom does not complete itself in a day, or a week, or even a year. Trauma and ideology do not dissolve simply because evidence contradicts them. Many of the women held in Allied detention facilities after the war continued to believe, or at least to profess belief, in the righteousness of Japan's cause. They returned to a Japan devastated by firebombing and atomic weapons, where the emperor had remained on the throne, and the question of war guilt was so complex and politically fraught that entire generations would struggle with it. Most of these women never spoke publicly about their experiences. The shame of capture, even if they were treated well, was too great. But in private testimonies, in oral histories collected decades later, a pattern emerges. The women who survived capture by Allied forces and were treated according to Geneva Convention standards, given food, medical care, shelter, and yes, hot water for bathing, describe a slow, painful process of ideological unraveling. The initial shock of humane treatment was followed by confusion, then anger, then a kind of grief for the years spent believing lies. Some never fully reconciled it. Others quietly passed the lesson on to their children. Do not trust governments that promise glory through death. Do not believe propaganda that dehumanizes enemies. Remember that the smallest acts of ordinary kindness can reveal the largest lies. One woman, interviewed in 1989 at the age of 67, described it this way: "The hot water was the beginning of my re-education. Not because the Americans tried to teach me anything. They did not. They were just following their rules. But the fact that their rules included hot water for prisoners While our rules included telling women to kill themselves rather than be captured, told me everything I needed to know about which system valued human life and which system consumed it. The symbolic power of hot water extends beyond this specific moment. Throughout the Pacific War, the contrast between material abundance and scarcity defined much of the Japanese military's experience. Japanese soldiers and civilians endured shortages that grew more severe as the war progressed. Shortages of food, fuel, medicine, and basic supplies. American forces, by contrast, operated with a logistical infrastructure that seemed almost incomprehensible to their enemies. American soldiers had abundant food, medical supplies, equipment. They had ice cream ships, mobile hospitals, supply chains that stretched across oceans without breaking. This material abundance was not just tactical. It was ideological. It represented the productive capacity of democratic industrial capitalism, a system that could simultaneously wage total war and maintain a standard of living for its civilians and soldiers that authoritarian empires could not match. The hot water in that Okinawa washroom was not special. It was baseline. It was what American military regulations specified for POW processing because the infrastructure existed to provide it, because the resources were available, because the system had not yet collapsed under its own weight. For the Japanese women, this was incomprehensible. Japan's empire had promised self-sufficiency, regional dominance, and the creation of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere that would rival Western powers. Instead, by 1945, Japanese civilians were starving, cities were ash, and the military was reduced to training schoolgirls to fight landing forces with bamboo spears. The contrast between the promise and the reality was so vast that encountering even a fragment of American material abundance, hot water in a POW facility, felt like stepping into a different universe. The water runs hot because the system that captured these women has not collapsed. It has the fuel to heat water, the infrastructure to deliver it, the bureaucratic capacity to mandate its provision. This is what abundance looks like. Not luxury, but the ability to provide basic dignity even to enemies because the cost of doing so is negligible, because the system can afford it. The Japanese Empire could not afford hot water for prisoners. It could barely afford food for its own soldiers. The difference is not moral, though morality matters. It is structural. One system was still functioning. The other was burning. In the weeks and months that follow, the 47 women in that Okinawa detention facility are processed, interviewed, and eventually repatriated to a Japan they barely recognize. The cities they left are gone, replaced by rubble and makeshift shelters. The empire that sent them to war has vanished overnight. The emperor reduced from divine sovereign to symbolic figurehead in a single radio broadcast. The women carry with them the memory of hot water, and that memory is both comfort and accusation. It comforts because it proves they were not destroyed, that they survived even the collapse of their world. It accuses because it reveals how much was taken from them by a regime that valued their deaths more than their lives. Corporal Yamamoto Setsuko returns to Hiroshima 3 months after the atomic bomb. Her family is dead. Her city is a wasteland. She finds work in a relief station, helping to distribute supplies sent by the occupation forces. She bathes in cold water for 2 years before she can afford a small heater. When she finally stands under hot water again, in 1947, in a public bathhouse that has been rebuilt, she does not cry. The tears are gone, but she remembers the washroom in Okinawa, and she thinks about how strange it is that the thing she remembers most clearly about the war's end is not the bomb, not the surrender, not the devastation, but the feeling of hot water on her skin and the realization that she had been lied to about everything. Lieutenant Peterson rotates back to the United States in November 1945. She returns to Minnesota, marries a doctor, has 3 children, and works as a school nurse for 30 years. She almost never speaks about the war. When she does not mention the Japanese women crying in the shower. It did not seem important at the time. Just another day processing prisoners, another task completed according to regulations. She does not know that for those women, that moment was a rupture, a crack in the wall of ideology that let reality flood in. She just remembers thinking it was sad. All those women crying, and wishing she understood more Japanese so she could tell them it would be okay. But she could not have explained what okay meant. Okay meant repatriation to a destroyed country. Okay meant living with the shame of capture in a culture that did not forgive survival. Okay meant rebuilding a life from rubble and rationed rice. Okay was not comforting. It was just the absence of the worst possibilities. And sometimes, in the aftermath of total war, absence is all that can be offered. The hot water runs, and the women cry, and the war ends, and life continues in the slow, grinding way that life continues after everything has been destroyed. The symbolic weight of the water, its warmth, its abundance, its ordinariness, carries a truth that neither side fully articulated at the time. That the distance between civilization and its collapse can be measured in the small things, in whether hot water is available for prisoners, in whether basic dignity is extended even to enemies, in whether a system values human life enough to include it in regulations and logistics. The Japanese Empire failed that test. It taught its people that death was preferable to capture, that enemies were subhuman, that prisoners did not deserve basic care. It built a system that consumed its own population, soldiers, civilians, women, children, and offered in return only the promise of glorious death. When that system collapsed, it left behind a generation of survivors who had to reconcile what they were taught with what they experienced, who had to live in the space between the propaganda and the reality, who carried the memory of that dissonance for the rest of their lives. The women who cried under the hot water in August 1945 were mourning, but not in the way Lieutenant Peterson understood. They were mourning the loss of certainty, the collapse of a worldview, the revelation that they had been expendable to the very regime that claimed to value them. The tears were not gratitude, not exactly. They were recognition. Recognition that kindness from enemies revealed cruelty from leaders. That hot water from captors exposed the inhumanity of commanders who told women to die rather than live. That the smallest act of ordinary decency could shatter the largest lie. And in that shattering, in that moment when the water runs warm and the ideology runs cold, lies a truth that survives the war, survives the propaganda, survives the decades of silence. That systems which value human life make different choices than systems which do not. That abundance, shared even with enemies, says something about priorities and values and the distance between rhetoric and reality. That sometimes the measure of civilization is not grand philosophy or noble speeches, but whether there is hot water for prisoners to wash the war away. The water runs. The women cry. The empire is gone, and what remains is memory. Fragile, contradictory, impossible to reconcile, and the knowledge that they survived not because they were strong enough to die with honor, but because they were human enough to live with shame. The hot water did not save them, but it marked the moment when survival became possible, when the world revealed itself to be different than they were taught, when the smallest kindness became evidence of the largest truth, that they had been betrayed by those who claimed to protect them, and treated with humanity by those they were taught to fear. The steam rises in the concrete washroom. The water runs warm, and 47 women stand under streams of ordinary mercy, weeping for everything they believed, and everything they lost, and everything they might, impossibly, still become in a world that did not end the way they were promised it would.